Hello artists, and welcome to day 78 of the epic journey here on DaleneFM-Art. Thank you for joining me. Today we're talking palette knives. So Heather Rob Lopecher has sent a message in asking me to go through palette knives, specifically their different uses, which palette knife is used for which technique. But since we're going through all the different genres of painting, one sort of genre at a time, I figured now is as good a time as any to actually go through palette knife painting as well. So we'll deal with the palette knives themselves, the tools that are used for palette knife painting, and then we'll go through and do a palette knife painting specifically. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk to you about palette knives is you get a palette knife and you get a painting knife. Now essentially they're the same thing. Painting knives, however, have got a slightly more blunt edge, and the reason for that is so that when you're painting on your canvas you don't accidentally cut your canvas or your support in any way. But otherwise they're much of a muchness. They're the same shape and they should be the same sprung steel, and you can use them interchangeably. It really isn't that much of an issue. But for the diehards, they will go for a blunter edge so as not to accidentally cut their support. The thing that you want more than anything else in a palette knife is sprung. You want it to be nice, good sprung steel. Let's see if I can show it against the dark grey background. You want it to be really nice and flexible. The palette knife is going to have to take a bit of a beating, so it must be able to flex really nicely against your canvas without tearing through your canvas or snapping the blade. You do get plastic palette knives. They are really not very nice to work with. The plastic tends to be a little bit thick and it is not flexible enough. They break very easily. They're just a poor quality. I suppose they'll be fine for mixing paint, but they're certainly not great for working on a canvas. The other thing that you're looking for in a palette knife is one that has a little bit of an angle to it. Now that is so that you can use it holding it and you'll still be able to touch your canvas without your knuckles getting in the way, as opposed to something like this, where if you try to get that onto your canvas, your knuckles are going to get in the way because it doesn't have that same trowel shaped blade to it. So for the rest of what I want to talk about with palette knives, I'm going to move the camera up overhead so that we can look down on a canvas, and we'll actually start applying paint to canvas, and we'll go through the different palette knives and what we can achieve with them. Alright, so as you can see, I've got a fist full of palette knives here. Various different palette knives for various uses, but what you will notice amongst my collection is that most of them are the trowel shaped palette knife. That's by far my favorite, and I find it the most versatile of the whole lot. I will just show you once again. I'll just show you once again on a surface, in case you didn't see earlier, the flexibility that you want out of a palette knife. You want it to really be able to flex and not break. I had a palette knife break on me once years ago, and nearly took my eye out, so it's a good idea not to have a palette knife that's going to break on you. So good spring, that is your most important feature of your palette knife. Another really important feature that you want out of a palette knife is one that is not going to do this. Now I've tried to super glue and all sorts of these particular palette knives, but it's really not fun. You don't want a palette knife that as you paint, your knife is going to stay still and your handle is going to change direction, or your handle is going to turn. You want a palette knife that's nice and rigid in its socket. There's a straight palette knife that doesn't have the trowel shaped handle to it, and like I was saying earlier on, when you put this palette knife down, there's a lot of space there between my canvas and the hand. I can get something under there, no problem. Whereas with this one, I'm going to battle to really get it down. I'm going to have to do that sort of thing to it because I can't really hold it and get it down onto the canvas as well. So definitely the trowel shaped one is a much nicer palette knife. I've then got these two little guys in my collection, both of which I will admit to not using terribly often. What I've got in my hand here are a few different types of trowels. I've got a few more different types of trowels. The only real difference between them being the width of the blade, and that's really nice for various different things. If you want to cover a large area, of course my large palette knife is going to do wonders. If I want to do fine little flowers, my little one is going to do wonders. This little guy here is very similar. He's just been around for a lot longer. His blade is a bit more flexible, so I tend to prefer him. and the point is a little bit sharper, or a little bit pointier, so I can get into little places quite nicely with that one. But otherwise, there's much of a muchness between them. If I was going to choose, these would be the two that I would work with. So we'll put those there. Then we've got these guys as well. We'll go through what they can do. The first thing that I want to discuss is actually applying the paint to canvas. Now what I've got here is a bit of paint that has got nothing in it. There's no additive to it. It's not thinned down in any way. And the canvas that I'm working, you will recognize from when I was doing the impressionistic brush strokes. I'm just reusing the same canvas so as not to mess up too many extraneous canvases. When you work with a palette knife, you want to work with thick impasto paint. You can get an additive that you put into it called impasto medium, and what it does is it'll just extend your paint to go a little bit further. It won't create any opacity problems with your paint, and it will allow you to really load paint onto your canvas and not worry about being too frugal with your paint because of the expense. But it is quite common to work with paint straight out of the tube, particularly with oil paints, because oil paints are generally quite thick, especially if you've got a really good quality oil paint. Acrylic paints might need a bit of an additive to it to thicken them up. They're texture medium possibly, to help thick, because they've also got acrylic. The acrylic version of impasto paint is texture medium. So the first thing I'm going to do is just spread a little bit on here and to go through with you the kind of thing that you would do to blend. Now working with a palette knife, it's big bold colors. You're not necessarily colors, but it's big bold movements. You're not going to get a lot of fine detail except on a very big canvas where you can, you know, get in there with a small little palette knife. And the nice thing, what I've just done here is I've put a bit of orange and a bit of burnt umber here and mix them together, burnt sienna, and mix them together, and you see you get this sort of streakiness happening here, and it's really, really nice. You can get this marbling effect so beautifully. So you can really have a lot of fun with your palette knife and actually using your canvas and your palette knife to physically mix the paint as you're painting. So it's really fun to use your palette knife to actually physically mix paint on your canvas with your palette knife to get some lovely effects. Notice how I'm spreading it on almost like spreading peanut butter on a slice of bread, or jam on a slice of bread. You're literally spreading it on. If I push too hard, I'm going to be scraping it off, and I would obviously want to do that for various times, but if I'm applying, no, I'm spreading it quite even. You'll notice as I'm scraping, I'm never going to get all this color off like I would if it was on a piece of glass when I was mixing paint, and that is because obviously the paint is filling the tooth of the canvas. So as you go over it, so the paint is being squeezed into the tooth of the canvas, and unless you wash this now with turps, you're not going to get it out. But you can spread it really nice and evenly. However, if you're working, I'm just using this as an example, this is just a little canvas that my daughter threw paint on a little while ago and painted as a Mommy's Day present for me, but it's got a lot of texture on it. Now if you take a blob of paint and you try and smooth that on with your palette knife, you're really not going to get anywhere near the same effect, because the paint itself is giving you a rough surface texture to work with. Now what will happen is if you do a layer of palette knife painting and then come back when it's dry and try to add to it, you're going to end up getting this effect instead of that effect. And if that's what you're looking for, that's fine. It's really not an issue. But if it's not what you're looking for, then you've got to be really aware of it. And it's for that reason that most artists will actually do palette knife paintings in one sitting. It'll just be a single sitting painting and everything is worked wet on wet. Now it's a good idea to have a good handy cloth next to you when you're working, because you're going to have to wipe your palette knife continually, and you really do go through a lot of paint. So if you're worried about the amount of paint that you're going to go through, then by all means get yourself an impasto medium, but be aware that palette knife work does take a lot of paint. Another thing that we've got to remember with palette knife work, it's a good idea when you're painting is to paint towards yourself with your trowel at that angle, sort of at like 45-degree angle-ish towards yourself, or if you're painting away from yourself, then you're going to go at the opposite angle and go away from yourself. But when you're painting, you've kind of got to be cognizant of where your paint goes, because if you're going to paint towards yourself, you want to pick your paint up that it's loaded on the opposite side of the trowel. So you're going to pick it up towards you and paint it on. If you're going to be painting away from yourself, then you want to pick it up away from you and paint away from yourself, so that your paint ends up on the correct side of the trowel. It would be a little bit, let's just move all of this. It would be a little bit counterproductive if I picked it up on the one side and then try to paint on the other side, because all my paint is sitting on the wrong side of my palette knife. So if I paint away from myself, I'm not going to get the same coverage as if I would if I was painting towards myself. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to mess around with the colors that I happen to have here, which is the burnt umber and the orange. And I'm just going to spread, I'm not trying to do anything specific, I'm just spreading paint around because I just want to, sorry, burnt sienna and orange. I'm just going to be spreading paint around so that I can just show you a couple of other things that you can do with your palette knife that will involve a wet surface. Like I said, palette knife painting is very much a wet on wet exercise. And if you do it wet on dry, then you've just got to understand that all these ridges and bumps that you're creating here with your palette knife are going to actually end up affecting your second layer of paint and how it is going to not be smooth as such. Oopsie. It's a bit like icing a cake. It's great fun, I must say. When I've done palette knife paintings, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. When one does a palette knife painting for the first time, you do feel very much like a duck out of water, because it's terribly different to painting with a brush, and you do kind of feel as if you don't have the same sort of control that you do with a brush. But you get used to it, and you start to learn to manipulate the palette knife in a way that it gets you what you're looking for, and you learn to thin the paints out to get more smooth areas. You learn to blend nicely. It just takes practice, I suppose, like any other field of painting. It just takes practice. Now, another thing with palette knife work is that you really don't need an underpainting with palette knife work. Most palette knife artists will paint directly onto a white canvas. You can put a underpainting on if you want to. It might help you in some way depending on your composition, but it really isn't as necessary with palette knife work as it might be with brush work. And the reason for that, of course, is because the paint is so thick that there's really not much chance of seeing what is underneath this paint. Alright, I'm going to come in here with my small little trowel. I'm going to pick up a bit of white paint on my trowel, and I'm just going to see what I can do with it. Such pretty effects that you can get. If you were, for example, painting a flower, you could get little petals going on there, and you'd see, because you're putting wet paint into wet paint, you get the paint underneath starts to mix and create little nice effects. And also what you can do when you've got these thick bits, you can spread them out to create fine tips to petals or tips to leaves or whatever it is that you're painting. Well, that wasn't very fun. But you can drag them into your paint to create little fine lines, fine effects. Now, that's the nice thing about with a palette knife, even it's actually with any of the shapes, you can use the edge of your palette knife to get some interesting things going there. But I don't have a sample of one with me, but you do get a palette knife that's got quite a sharp angle, and that often is used for dipping in the paint. You spread it along the blade and then you would line to get a thin line. But what I do is I use my trowel blade, my long trowel blade, and I will load it off camera. I'll show it to you in a minute. So I just dab it in the paint so that it's all along the edge of it, and then you can streak it to get little thin lines. So that's nice for various effects, like the masts of a boat, for example, if that's what you're painting, for trees in a marsh. You can get fine lines going. So you don't have to have the palette knife that is generally accepted to do this. You can use your trowel palette knife. Now this chappy here that's got a round edge would just be to give you would just be to give you a different shape. So you could do flowers. You could do that kind of thing, flowers that are going to give you a different shape, and then you could come back here with a sharper point and put a little bit of a center to your flower. So there's lots of fun that you can have with palette knives, and the different palette knives become a personal preference. Whichever knife suits the way that you work. Like I say, I tend to stick to the trowel shape. That's what I like, but that only comes with practice, testing out all the different knives, deciding which one you like best. Now let's take a little palette and do a small flower. Now you see what I'm doing is I'm pushing away, I'm squeezing the paint out and then pulling towards me, because I'm building up little petals. Now obviously this is extremely thick impasto paint, and you wouldn't necessarily do it this thick. Again, personal preference. But again, let's spread all this out and see what lovely effects that we can get. So pretty. Alright, then of course there's lots of other things that you can do with your palette knife. The scraping. Now this, what I'm doing now, is called sgraffito, which is a direct translation from the Latin, from the Spanish, from the Italian, meaning to scrape. So you could actually get some lovely effects by putting a different color. Like now I've got the blue on the canvas below, I scrape the paint off and I can see all the burnt sienna and the orange and the yellow and the white paint that's kind of in layers there. Now I can see that peeping through. So that is also something that you can use to your advantage, your sgraffito effect. Now that of course brings me to your humble paintbrush. Now the paintbrush, some paintbrushes have got a slightly sharp tip, some paintbrushes have got a round tip, and that's for the same thing, for scraping into your paint. So you don't only have to use a palette knife when you're working with a palette knife type painting. Now this little guy I've got in front of me is actually a clay working tool. I've got a few different types. This one has got a little beveled edge, I've got a pointed edge, and I've got another one here that's got a pointed edge and a beveled edge, and this is for a very similar thing. You can scratch out, and what's so nice about this is you get a very, because it's rubber or silicone, you get a very definite line. You can get a slightly more accurate effect than you would if it was a palette knife, because it's flexible, it's going to get into the canvas there, and you can pick up some fine lines or some thick lines. There's all sorts of tools that a palette knife painter will use on his painting. These things will do exactly the same thing, it's just the same tool in a different way. They're much softer, so it's also going to pick up a lot of paint. Slightly harder pressure will pick up a lot more paint than a lighter pressure. So these tools are really fun to work with palette knife. Another thing that is fun to work with is a credit card, an old credit card. I don't have one with me, but it really is fun to scrape the surface of your painting with a palette knife and get some lovely effects going. And in fact, when you watch this video, I'll put up a picture now that shows you what I had. This is a painting that I did of a dancer some time ago, and that entire background is done with a credit card. So I've had a lot of fun with credit cards. So it's not only palette knife work, it's not only a palette knife that one has to use. You can use almost any tool. But the feature of palette knife painting is thick impasto paint that you can write into, that you can scratch into, that you can move around on your painting. Another thing that we have to really remember about palette knife painting is that because the paint is so thick, you end up having to leave it for a very long time to dry. I had a painting once that had been sitting for I don't want to lie to you, but it was probably about 3 or 4 months, and it was still not completely dry. It forms a bit of a skin over some of the thicker areas. It will form a skin, but the paint inside that is still very delicate, and those if that skin breaks and that paint gets squashed, then it totally destroys the effect that you've created while painting it. So it's something that you have to be aware of, that a palette knife painting is going to have to sit for a long time to completely dry once you've seriously plastered impasto paint all over it. Okay, so my husband and I are busy having a conversation as to what the square tipped one will do, because I haven't talked about it yet. But effectively, I suppose it's like any other palette knife. The shape of the knife is going to give you the shape of what you're putting down on it. So if you want something that needs a more square tip, then by all means this can be used. And the same will go for something with a finer point. Let me just load up my palette knife here. If I load the palette knife that the paint is even at the back, and I simply squish it down and pull away, I'm getting paint lifting on either side of the palette knife, and it's going to come down to a finer point, as opposed to either one of these two that the paint is not going to squish on either side. Just load it evenly in the back. It's not going to squish on either side because it's so wide, and it's not going to pull to a point. So there's much of a muchness between these two. I think this little guy is a little bit easier to work with because of the rounder corners, but there might be times that you might need to do something like that, and you want something that's going to give you a squarer tip. Again, you know, like I said, the tools that you use are specific to you, the way that you use them and what it is that you're trying to create at the time. So there's no one particular palette knife for one particular technique. The palette knives are quite interchangeable. It becomes about what you like, which palette knife you like, and which you feel most comfortable using to create the various different effects. And it's going to take time and practice to get all the different things right. What I'm going to do tomorrow, I'm going to start working on a palette knife painting. I think I'm going to do a seascape. I've got one earmarked. I think that's the one that I'm going to do. And we'll actually go through a painting from start to finish, and all the different things that one can do, and the different effects that one can create on a palette with a palette knife. But basically what I've gone through there now with you tonight is everything that you need to know about palette knife work. From here going forward, it's just all about practice and having a lot of fun. You will feel like a duck out of water when you first start doing this. If you've never worked with a palette knife before, it is going to feel really, really weird. And it is going to, you're going to feel as if you really don't know what you're doing, but that's not the case at all. It feels very different, and it just takes a lot of practice. So have fun with your palette knives, folks, and I will see you tomorrow in day 79 when we start working on a palette knife drawing. Thank you for joining me. Please like and share this video, and do whatever it is you do around the internet with it, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, bye. That's what you want to do.